noches a todos, gracias por venir. Vamos a comenzar con el acto de apertura de la Conferencia Nacional de Python, la PyConES 2019, que este año celebra su 7ª edición en la Universidad de Alicante. Año 2013. Un grupo de jóvenes decide comenzar una apasionante aventura y se embarcan en la no desdeñable misión de conseguir que la primera PyConES fuera una realidad. En esa época, el que por entonces fuera el presidente de la Asociación Python España y miembro del colectivo AeroPython, Juan Cano, conoció a la Asociación de Ingenieros Químicos de la Universidad de Alicante, CACHEME, representada en ese momento por Francisco Navarro Brull. Este fructífero encuentro propició que el primero de ellos viajara hasta la universidad para impartir un curso de introducción a Python en ciencia e ingeniería, que todavía hoy es uno de los más consultados en el repositorio de la universidad. En este curso, dos jóvenes novatos descubrieron que efectivamente la programación podría aplicarse a campos diferentes de la informática, pulsando esa tecla en ellos que consiguió que quisieran conocer más acerca de ese nuevo lenguaje que habían conocido. La de 2014 fue su primera PyConES en Zaragoza. Después de ello, 2015, Valencia, 2016, Almería, este mismo año un AeroPython en Bilbao, 2017, Cáceres, 2018 en Málaga y finalmente 2019 aquí en Alicante. Estos dos jóvenes de los que hablo se encuentran hoy en esta mesa. En el extremo derecho, Zuria Bauer, chair de la PyConES 2019 y también de la Django Girls Alicante, que tuvo lugar ayer, y un servidor, Daniel Domene, también chair de la PyConES 2019. Es para mí un verdadero honor daros la bienvenida a la Universidad de Alicante. Junto a mí en la mesa se encuentran Juan Cano en el centro, presidente de la Asociación Python España y también chair del Congreso. A su derecha se encuentra Javier Montoyo, representando a la Escuela Politécnica, es el coordinador académico de prácticas externas, y a mi derecha se encuentra el catedrático de Ingeniería Química, don Ignacio Martín Gullón, representando a la Universidad de Alicante. En este momento me gustaría ceder la palabra a Juan Luis, presidente de la asociación.
Bueno, buenos días a todos. Muchísimas gracias por venir y madrugar después de la intensa noche de ayer. Estamos muy contentos de haber batido récord de entradas vendidas este año una vez más. Si hubiera sido por vosotros, habríamos vendido 1000 o 1100 entradas, no lo sé, pero nos hemos quedado en 850 asistentes, nada menos. Y muchísimas gracias a nuestros organizadores jefes, Zuria y Daniel, porque han hecho un trabajo increíble durante todo este año, impagable totalmente. Y muchísimas gracias a nuestros patrocinadores también, que han tenido un papel fundamental en que este evento sea accesible para todo el mundo y han tenido mucha paciencia también con los que estamos aquí respondiendo emails. Muchísimas... No me quiero extender, simplemente os deseo que disfrutéis mucho el evento y aparte de aprender mucho Python y conectar con la gente, que apliquéis, bueno, una pequeña regla que le he aprendido en otros congresos, que es que tenéis que intentar conocer a tanta gente nueva como PyConES hayáis venido. O sea que si es vuestra 7ª edición, como es mi caso, tenéis que intentar conocer a 7 personas nuevas. Así que hay mucho donde elegir, os animo a que abráis vuestro círculo y establezcáis lazos nuevos con toda la gente nueva que ha venido. Así que nada más.
Muchas gracias, Juan Luis. Tiene la palabra Javier Montoyo, representante de la Escuela Politécnica Superior de Alicante.
Muchas gracias, Daniel. Bueno, en primer lugar, daros la bienvenida a la Universidad de Alicante y agradeceros pues eso, vuestra presencia aquí. Para nosotros es un honor que estéis aquí. Y hoy en día es muy importante este tipo de eventos porque los perfiles técnicos van evolucionando por cuestiones que todos conocemos y este tipo de conferencias, este tipo de eventos demuestran que es así. Y, de hecho, este evento es tremendo porque tiene un montón de actividades y talleres en paralelo que son impresionantes y una comunidad detrás que demuestra pues eso, que están en constante aprendizaje y con ganas de no quedarse atrás en este cambio que se produce en el mundo tecnológico diariamente. Bueno, pues sin más, tampoco me quiero extender porque ya vamos con un poquillo de retraso. Volveros a dar las gracias por haber venido a la Universidad de Alicante y espero que disfrutéis de esta conferencia.
Muchas gracias, Javier. Cedo en este momento la palabra al profesor Ignacio.
Buenos días. Me sumo a mi compañero Javier y os doy la bienvenida en nombre del rector a la Universidad de Alicante. Es realmente impresionante ver cómo un sábado por la mañana hay reunida aquí tanta gente para atender este evento y sobre todo saber que tiene más de 800 inscritos. Además se ve bastante variedad, distintos tipos de perfiles entre los asistentes, no solo, digamos, estudiantes o gente del ámbito académico. Agradezco en mi nombre y también en el nombre del rector que la Asociación PyConES España seleccionase a la Universidad de Alicante como sede de esta edición. Y espero que todos podáis disfrutar de nuestro campus universitario y también de nuestra ciudad y de los alrededores. Quiero darle enhorabuena a los organizadores de este evento y me gustaría también decir que le he dado clase a 2 personas que están sentadas en esta mesa y además de que también le he dado clase a otras personas que veo dentro de la gente que está en el público. El conjunto de voluntarios que están trabajando en la logística de este evento es muy importante y se ve que está todo bastante bien engrasado. Y felicitación a ellos también. Tampoco me quiero olvidar y agradecer al personal de la universidad en el trabajo que han realizado en estas últimas semanas en conseguir que todas las instalaciones estén a punto. Muchas gracias por vuestra asistencia y que disfrutéis del evento.
Muchas gracias, Ignacio. Voy a pasar al atril para comentar algunos detalles que se van a desarrollar durante la conferencia. ¿Estoy en pantalla? Perfecto. ¿Se oye?
No.
Bajito.
¿Ahora? Bueno, en primer lugar me gustaría sumarme a la felicitación y agradecimiento que ha comentado la mesa y principalmente la que hace referencia a los patrocinadores, pues gracias a vosotros hemos conseguido que un año más podamos haber hecho una conferencia efectivamente accesible a un elevado número de personas. Concretamente tenemos 786 inscritos en admisión general y tenemos 50 inscritos del taller de Django Girls, que gracias a estos patrocinios han sido invitadas estas chicas a que puedan asistir a los talleres y las conferencias. Toda la información relativa al evento, principalmente en cuestiones de agenda y calendario, las tenéis publicadas en la página web. Aquí. En esta edición vamos a contar con la presencia de 3 charlas plenarias. La primera de ellas, Safia Abdala, que está con nosotros aquí, Francisco Javier Ordóñez, que será esta tarde en el Salón de Actos del Aulario 2, no será aquí, y mañana será Pablo Galindo el encargado de la sesión final, que sí que se realizará aquí en el Paraninfo. El domingo por la mañana teníamos prevista una plenaria también y en este momento me gustaría recordar a Mabel, que era la ponente, que por motivos personales no ha podido asistir, pero me ha comentado que os transmita, digamos, la enhorabuena al equipo y un saludo a todos y que en la siguiente edición estará aquí para darlo todo también. Como comentaba, hemos tenido una multitud de patrocinadores, en concreto 33, que no solo nos han permitido crear la logística, sino que también hemos podido dar más de 4.000 euros en becas de transporte, alojamiento y entradas en admisión general para aquellos colectivos que no podían permitirse asistir a la conferencia, y además tenemos un servicio de interpretación de signos para aquellas personas con dificultades auditivas. Este año el presidente de la asociación estaba especialmente orgulloso que después de 7 ediciones hemos conseguido también tener una ludoteca.
Más bien que hayan niños en la ludoteca.
Que hayan niños, exactamente, que hayan conseguido venir. Y transmito, digamos, el sentimiento de la asociación en que al final esta inclusión y esta adaptación de la conferencia vaya en esa dirección, porque al final la genera la comunidad de Python, y la comunidad de Python se caracteriza por ser abierta, dinámica y accesible para todos. Pormenores para el día de hoy. Aquellas personas que no estén acreditadas no pasa nada, porque las acreditaciones están previstas después de la plenaria. Será en el aulario 2. Tendremos que desplazarnos desde aquí, que estamos en el Paraninfo, caminar un poquito por el campus, que ya veréis que es una maravilla, con zonas arboladas y ajardinadas, y llegar al aulario 2. Permitidme que os haga la recomendación de que entréis por la puerta central, en mitad del anfiteatro, ya lo veréis cuando lleguéis, está en esta zona de aquí. Nosotros tenemos ahí el stand de acreditaciones para todo aquel que no lo haya hecho todavía. Si eres ponente, por favor, dirígete al stand de la derecha. Y si eres miembro de las Django Girls, por favor, dirígete también a este stand e identifícate como chica Django. Enseguida que terminemos y vayamos allí, nos hayamos acreditado, en la primera planta del aulario 2 tendrá lugar el coffee break. Los patrocinadores estarán colocados en todo el semicírculo del hall principal del aulario 2. La sesión de pósters, que en principio es una nueva modalidad que hemos introducido este año, estará disponible en los descansos entre sesiones. Aquellos autores que tienen póster tienen la opción de estar junto al póster en estos descansos, y los miembros de las empresas encargadas y el resto de asistentes podrán acceder a ellos para realizarles cuestiones relativas a su trabajo y, como comentaba Juan Luis, para que podáis conoceros también entre vosotros y generar un bonito networking. Tengo aquí el plano, como comentaba, las acreditaciones están aquí. Tenemos 5 sesiones en paralelo, como comentábamos, tenemos más de 800 personas inscritas y tenemos más de 1.100 sillas, pero esto no implica que no se puedan generar problemas de movimiento de personal. En este sentido, me gustaría pediros paciencia, que seáis diligentes, que vayáis ordenadamente y que si entráis a una sesión, que vayáis completando de manera ordenada las aulas. Tenemos como sala magna el Salón Microsoft, que está localizado nada más entrar al aulario. Tenemos la sala Ilion, la sala Eventbrite, identificadas a la derecha de este salón, y la sala Universidad y la sala de la Python Software Foundation a la izquierda. También, al mismo tiempo, tenemos habilitadas 2 salas de talleres. Cuando os acreditéis, o después de acreditaros a lo largo de la mañana y del sábado, si tenéis problemas de conectividad con el wifi en momentos puntuales, no de manera continua, porque no tenemos tanto personal para que eso pueda ser así, hemos habilitado una zona para que podáis resolver vuestras cuestiones con la conectividad wifi, que es el número 3. La ludoteca estará situada en el extremo final del aulario 2. Aquellas mamás y papás que tengan niños tendrán que dirigirse ahí. Está convenientemente separada y tenemos que intentar el resto de asistentes no perturbar, digamos, la armonía que van a generar con estos niños, porque van a estar todo el día haciendo actividades. Entonces, si podemos evitar circular por esa zona, os lo agradeceríamos muchísimo. Los puntos rojos son las escaleras disponibles para subir al coffee break. Preferiblemente os recomiendo que utilicéis las de los extremos para que el flujo de gente sea mejor, para que los cafés se sirvan con un goteo continuo y no generemos problemas de atasco. La comida tendrá lugar en el punto número 3, es el launch. Saliendo del aulario 2, tendréis que girar hacia la derecha y podréis identificar el lugar porque os encontraréis una mano gigante con un lápiz. Si veis la mano, id hacia la mano. Después encontraréis un reloj de sol gigante también, porque aquí nos gustan hacer las cosas a lo grande. Ahí podréis comprobar si llevéis retraso o no, porque me han dicho que va a hacer sol, entonces estará operativo. Y en ese punto ya, digamos, tendréis visualización de las mesas y demás. Aquellos asistentes que tengáis una dieta especial, que ya no lo habéis hecho saber, por favor, hacérselo saber al servicio de catering cuando llegue vuestro turno. Me han comentado que van a intentar dividir las colas para que la cosa sea fluida y tendremos 3 posiciones para servir el catering. De acuerdo. ¿Disculpa, Pepper?
Daniel, ¿estás esperando a que se acabe mi batería para dejar de hablar y que dé comienzo la plenaria?
Disculpada, Pepper, parece que esta mañana debe de habérsele cruzado un cable.
Cuidado, recuerda que aunque tenga nervios de acero, hasta la organización tiene que seguir el código de conducta. Queremos que esto sea una conferencia en la que todas las personas se encuentren a gusto, sin distinción de ningún tipo. Eso también incluye los robots.
Pues me rindo a la evidencia, Pepper, y te pido disculpas, pero ¿podrías decirme qué te trae por aquí?
Salí al bosque a buscar boletos, y mira tú por donde acabe aquí, lo que es la vida.
Caray, no conocía esa faceta tuya. Pero bueno, ya que estás aquí con nosotros, ¿te gustaría anunciar a nuestra primera invitada?
Por supuesto, pero necesitaré la ayuda de Zuria. ¿Te importaría acompañarme en el atril?
Ya puedes empezar, Pepper.
Nuestra primera invitada es Safia Abdala. Trabaja en el proyecto Interact. Es escritora y además es ingeniera de software en Microsoft. Una de sus pasiones es unir a las personas para generar grandes momentos. Le gusta el emplear la narración de historias para compartir conocimientos y ha publicado un libro sobre ello.
Our first keynote is Safia Abdala. She's an open source maintainer at the Interact project. She's also a writer and a software engineer at Microsoft. She's passionate about bringing people together to build great things, and she loves using storytelling to share knowledge.
A pesar de su corta edad, ha participado en multitud de conferencias y en esta ocasión, recién llegada desde América, tiene la oportunidad de subirse de nuevo al escenario. Safia, por favor, te invitamos a que tomes posición.
Despite her young age, she has assisted to several conferences, and now she came all the way from America to give us our first speech at this conference. So, Safia, if you want to come to the stage.
Good morning. How's everyone doing? Fantastic. My name is Safia. I am your keynote for the day. I'm going to dive in and get started, and hopefully you enjoy the presentation. Can you raise your hand if you're familiar with what technology this person built? Does anyone want to volunteer an answer? What? COBOL? Compiler. Great. That's great to hear. A lot of people see this woman's face or her picture, but they're not usually aware of what she's done. She's very popular in pop culture and in tech culture in general for being an icon, but I often find that people aren't aware of the technical achievement that she developed, which is the compiler. Compilers are a very important thing. Prior to the invention of the compiler, the expectation was that software engineers or programmers would have to write code in a syntax that was dedicated for the machine as opposed to a human. So just to illustrate, this is an example of Hello World written in x86 assembly language. This is the expectation for how you would program several decades ago. It's completely inaccessible, confusing to read, and just hard to navigate. But with this notion of compilers, the idea that you can express programming ideas and algorithms in a higher level language that is much closer to English and then translate that to machine language was revolutionary, because instead of writing all of this, you could write this, which is much easier. And it made it easy for people to spread ideas using software. You no longer had to invest massive amounts of time to write and debug programs. It was easier to take the ideas that you had, write them in code, and share them with the world. And there's no doubt that everything that is possible today with technology, operating systems, web applications, all of the products that we use are inspired and motivated by the fact that compilers exist. And the fact that they make it easy to use code to spread ideas led to the existence of one particular thing, which is open source. Open source is an ecosystem of software where the code is freely accessible and available for users to modify. And this is particularly important to me because I happen to really love open source. I've been an open source maintainer and contributor for about 5 years now, which many people like to joke is almost a quarter of my life has been spent working in open source. And today I want to talk a little bit about why open source is important and what it can teach us about building software. Because it has a lot to teach us. There are decades of knowledge to gain from in learning open source, and lots of open source projects that have gained a lot of notoriety and have embedded themselves in the industry that we can learn from. Now, you're probably wondering, how do I know what I know about open source? What gives me the authority to speak on the topic? Well, for the past few years, I've been a maintainer and administrator at an open source organization called Interact. Interact is a project, well, literally it's an open source organization that consists of multiple projects that extend on the Jupyter ecosystem. In the Interact team, we have several different projects that we open source. One of them is a desktop application that allows users to read and edit Jupyter notebooks from their desktop. Raise your hand if you're familiar with Jupyter notebooks. Yeah, great. So Interact allows you to read and edit Jupyter notebooks from your desktop. We have an Atom extension that allows you to interact with Jupyter notebooks from the Atom code editor. We have projects like Papermill, which allow you to use Jupyter notebooks as part of your DevOps pipeline. And we also provide an SDK that can be used to build notebook experiences for your own applications. So Interact is quite a large ecosystem of open source projects. And from managing this ecosystem and working under it, I've had the chance to learn quite a few things about what it means to build software that people can use and that people can contribute back to. And I've distilled it to 5 main points. First, culture and people. Second, roadmaps and vision. Third, composable and robust design. Fourth, documentation and communication. And fifth, building for the future. Now, I want to start off first and foremost by talking about culture and people, which are the most important elements of any organization or open source project. I'm glad the robot is really interested in what I have to say. So you might have heard this phrase, you are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. I think this is particularly true, but I think it's even more so when we talk about open source communities. An open source community is the average of the people who contribute. So how do you establish the norms and expectations of this wide pool of contributors? You might have individuals contributing to an open source project that are in your city or halfway across the world. Indeed, that's the case in the Interact project. We have contributors from North America, we have European contributors, we have contributors in Asia. People all across the world are coming together to build this one piece of software. So how do we make sure that our collective identity speaks for all of us? One of the ways that we establish this in the Interact project is a code of conduct. Codes of conduct are documents that outline the expected behavior within a community. Most people think that a code of conduct is a way of dealing with harassment or bad actors in the community. But I actually think that they are much more than that. They're a way of writing down the ideals that a community agrees upon in a codified way. It's a group of people coming together to collectively say, this is what we want to do, and this is how we choose to behave while doing it. This is particularly important when you're bringing people together who are not just your coworkers or your friends, but strangers on the internet, which is generally what open source is. One of the things that the Interact project recently did, and I recommend that any open source organization or even companies do, is we went through a code of conduct training. We had a consultant come in and guide us through different ways we could enforce a code of conduct and write one. And one of the interesting things we learned from this is that the project mission should be stated in the code of conduct. Many codes of conduct state the expected behaviors and the way that a community will monitor and address situations, but it never states why these rules exist. And indeed, that's the most important thing. Why are you coming together to build software? Why are you writing this code of conduct if you don't state it in your document? And I find that this is really important because it establishes a North Star for the organization. Now, the result of having a code of conduct and a mission statement and agreed upon norms is that your open source project has a personality, and for some of them, they have a reputation. Think about how you feel being a member of the Python community or the PyData community. Think about what that means to you and the personality and reputation that you associate with it. Now, think about some open source communities that notoriously have a less than favorable view from people. I won't name any names, but I'm sure you can think of open source projects where you feel like the community isn't particularly accessible. This is important because this kind of personality and reputation dictates what kinds of people are willing to participate in your project or not. And it's not just established on GitHub. It's established in discussion groups, on Stack Overflow, in web articles. All of this tone and language and ideas that we share don't just happen when we write the code. They happen when we speak about the code, when we help provide support on the code, and in various other places. And this applies to software organizations as well, private or public companies writing software. Is anyone familiar with Stripe or perhaps Twilio? Yes, so they are open source, or they're software companies. They provide APIs, and one of the things I think is really compelling about these companies is they are very active on Stack Overflow, on GitHub, on various discussion platforms, because they recognize that the personality of a product is not just the code or the software itself, but the way you talk about it and message it. And you know, what is the impact of having a code of conduct, having a mission statement, all of these things? Recently, someone in the PyData community, which if you are maybe unfamiliar with what that is, PyData is the sphere of projects within the Python ecosystem that are related to open science and data science. So recently there was an analysis done of a variety of projects within this PyData ecosystem around diversity. In particular, diversity of contributors. And Interact was classified as one of the most diverse open source projects within the PyData ecosystem. And there was an interesting analysis done. There's a Jupyter notebook, which I will have a link to at the end of my slides. When this was announced, one of the questions that a lot of individuals got in the Interact leadership board was, how? How does this happen? How are you such a diverse project when this is so rare to see in open source? The first thing is, don't approach D&I as a checkbox item. This is the case for a lot of companies, I will say, and definitely for some open source projects. It's often seen as a checkbox item, something that you do just because it's relevant, people seem to care about it, but oftentimes there's no real action behind it. And what I've learned from running the Interact project for 5 years is that inclusion happens in small actions as opposed to overt gestures. It's not about sponsoring a scholarship at a conference or participating in mentorship events. It's really simple things that establish inclusivity. Thanking someone for submitting a pull request. Shutting down a conversation if people are starting to grow hostile or have a lot of vitriol to each other. Including someone in a conversation, bringing them in if there's a technical discussion on GitHub or a meeting somewhere. Those small actions do so much more to make people feel included as part of a team than any overt gesture ever will, in my experience. And they're a lot harder to do because you have to do them every day. They're not a one-time thing, it's a consistent practice. I think the robot liked that one. The other thing that we do is reduce the barriers to advancement within the project. So in a lot of open source projects, you submit your first contribution, it gets accepted, maybe after making some changes, and you continue making contributions until eventually you are made a maintainer. Maintainer is a strange term in open source software. Generally, it means someone who is responsible for maintaining the project, keeping it existing, managing issues, things like that. But this distinction is kind of ambiguous, and it can sometimes be weaponized in certain open source projects. There are these arbitrary distinctions set up, and there's gatekeeping that happens. So that if you want to be a maintainer of the project, you have to do X, Y, and Z. But X, Y, and Z are different depending on who you are. One of the ways that we address this in the Interact project is removing the barriers to advancement within Interact. So, for example, if you submit a pull request to the Interact project, it's reviewed and it's eventually merged. You now are a member of the Interact organization, which means that you can merge pull requests, you can review code, you can close issues and open them, you can participate in the project as a full-fledged maintainer after submitting and having one pull request merged. Now, a lot of people get really scared when I say this. They say, but wait, if all you have to do is submit one pull request to become a maintainer, doesn't that mean that you have really low quality maintainers or contributions? No, that's not the case. In fact, what I've seen is that it's best not to assume malintent or incompetence from people, and to generally give them the power and the privilege of being a maintainer as soon as possible. And they will understand how to use that privilege accordingly. They will monitor issues appropriately, they'll participate well in PRs, and they'll grow to be really great members of the community. A lot of the gatekeeping that we set up to keep incompetent people out actually keeps malicious people in. And finally, meeting contributors where they are. Not everyone can contribute to open source. One of the things that you need to be an open source maintainer is a lot of time. I happen to be in open source because I'm a boring person who has no hobbies, so I just write code in my free time. But to get a wider pool of contributions, you need to not only be active on GitHub and participate with the community there, but attend meetups. participate in community events like Hacktoberfest, which, if you're unfamiliar, it's a month-long event sponsored by DigitalOcean in the month of October, where you can win a free shirt if you submit a pull request that gets merged into an open source project. Or, present at conferences across the globe. We have had Interact community members present at conferences in the States, in Europe. Meeting people where they are helps bring them to your project. Once you have all of those people who are contributors or active members of the Interact of your project, you have to set a vision for them. Open source is a very purpose-driven activity. There's not a lot of money to be made in open source. Despite what you might think, it's not very glamorous to be an open source maintainer. But I find that a lot of people, including my own colleagues, participate in open source because they very much so believe in the mission and the purpose of the software that they are building. And a lot of individuals who continue to participate in open source are very mission-driven. They don't just care about the code, they care about what it does and why it's doing it. And so you have to establish purpose for all of the contributors on a project. One of the ways that we establish purpose on the Interact project is through a roadmap. A roadmap is some sort of document that dictates the high-level priorities of an open source project over a particular amount of time. If you work at a private company or a public company, you might be familiar with roadmaps. Many companies will set them every quarter or every year, but it's not that common for an open source project to create a roadmap. In the Interact project, we create roadmaps. And one of the things that's important is I think you can distill a good roadmap into 3 things: what you want to do, why you want to do it, and how you plan to do it. That's it. You don't have to write a super long, verbose document that outlines these. It's 3 simple points. In a private company or a software organization, a roadmap is often written for the employees, perhaps the managers. But in an open source project, the roadmap is for everyone. It's for the contributors who are contributing to the project to understand what it is they're going to be doing over the next couple of months. It's for companies who use the open source project to know what the plan is for that project in the long term. It's for users of the project to understand what the priorities are. So you have to address a wide variety of individuals and audiences when you're writing your roadmap. One of the best ways to do this is to create the roadmap in multiple formats. So don't assume that just writing a markdown file and posting it on GitHub is the end of it, or writing a Google Doc and sharing that out. Indeed, you have to write a Google Doc for audiences who would benefit from that format. Use GitHub projects or a Kanban board for developers or engineers who might benefit from that format. And explore different ways of communicating the same thing in different platforms so that people get the message in a way that's most attuned to them. And I think also writing roadmaps more frequently than you think you should. In the Interact project, we do it on a yearly basis, but we're learning that that's actually not fast enough to respond to changes within the open source project. So perhaps 6 months is a more accurate frequency to do it in. But exploring these kinds of parameters on how often you should draft a roadmap, how many items should be in your roadmap, is something that a project can do. And on this topic of experimentation, I think it's important to always have a very experimental approach to open source. Each open source project is different. You can't compare the Interact project to the Python project. And as such, the ideas and things that work for one project are not going to work for another. So you have to be open to iterating and experimenting on an individual basis with this project. Now, you have the contributors, you have the roadmap and the vision set for the project. The next thing is, actually writing software, which can be very difficult sometimes, especially when you have to do it with hundreds of people across the globe. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the design and engineering principles that we leverage on the Interact project that have helped us improve the way that we write software. I am a big believer in Conway's Law. Is anyone familiar with Conway's Law? Quite a few people are. So Conway's Law is not really a law per se because it hasn't been thoroughly validated. I will say, the scientist in me will say that. But it's essentially a theory that organizational structure is reflected in the design of systems. So if you work at a software company where your back-end team and your front-end team are two completely separate teams and they don't communicate very often, that organizational structure will be reflected in the way your software system is designed. You'll probably have some sort of application structure where the back end and the front end don't communicate with each other all quite too well. It might be not the best design from a full stack perspective, things like that. Essentially, the way that your team is structured affects the way that you write software. I personally have my own take on this, which is that you can create a system design that guides a particular organizational structure. What do I mean by this? Interact. It's an open source organization. There are multiple projects within the Interact umbrella. These are some of the ones that I was able to think of off the top of my head. You can see there's around 10 or so projects under the Interact umbrella here. Now, how do we manage and ensure that all of these different projects are working synergistically with each other? Let's take a look at some of the examples that we kind of use in the way we design the system and structure our code to make it a lot easier to work on. So the first is the Interact monorepo. Can you raise your hand if you're familiar with the monorepo concept? Okay, great. So the monorepo concept is essentially the notion that you have one repository that maintains all of the packages and assets that are related to your project. You might be familiar with Google. Internally, they have one shared version control system that contains all of the different products at Google. This is kind of a similar philosophy. We have an Interact monorepo, which contains all of the packages that we ship as part of our core SDK, which is one of the projects we have. And it also contains the applications, the desktop application and the web application that we ship. What is really great about this is it allows individuals to work on the ecosystem of packages within the Interact umbrella within a test harness. So when you clone the Interact monorepo, you have the individual packages that are used to build the notebook applications, and you have two test harnesses to work on, the desktop application and the web application. So right away, we've structured the code such that you're thinking about integration when you're writing it, because the code that you need to integrate against is right there. It's immediately adjacent. Another example of this is the Hydrogen project. The Hydrogen project is an Atom extension for the Atom code editor. It allows you to open Jupyter notebooks in Atom and execute your notebooks there, as opposed to the Jupyter Classic UI or in the Interact desktop app or in Jupyter Lab. And the Hydrogen project is a rather big project. It has around 1 million, I think over 1 million downloads on the Atom extension store. And it tends to operate independently of the desktop application and the web application because it's a completely different deployment target, so to speak. It's the Atom code editor. And so this project is in a separate repository. It leverages some of the same APIs and packages that the desktop application and the web application use because it also targets Jupyter, but it exists independently because the distinctions in the software are separate enough for users and contributors of that project to be able to work on it independently of the test harnesses that exist in the Interact monorepo. And so in this way, where the code is placed physically guides engineers to think about it in a particular way. Another example of this is the 0MQ node bindings. If you're familiar with the internals of the Jupyter ecosystem, a lot of the messaging that happens between what are known as Jupyter kernels, where code is executed, and clients operates through 0MQ. 0MQ is a low-level networking library. It's written in C, but it has bindings in multiple languages, such as Python, .NET, Node. Node is particularly interesting here because the Interact desktop application leverages these node bindings. When we first started the Interact project, the 0MQ bindings for Node were not in an ideal state. So we adopted the project temporarily, improved the bindings, and then moved it back to the 0MQ project. And I think this is a great way to showcase that code can move where it lives. Oftentimes in software engineering, we are taught to think and obsess about project structure. You'll see so many blog posts where people talk about what scaffold they should use for a Django project or a new JavaScript project. But the notion here requires a radical change in thinking, which is that the project structure should be fluid. The way the code is laid out in your project should be easy to change at any moment in time. I think this is a great way to think about it because it encourages engineers to think about design from a composable and modular perspective. If you anticipate that you're going to need to be able to move projects around or shuffle things at any moment in time, you're more inclined to build software that is more composable and modular. And in my opinion, composable and modular software is the easiest to maintain, to test, to deploy, to document, all of that good stuff. And so that's one of the reasons that we approach, that's one of the ways that we approach project management and physical software management in the Interact project, is it's seen as very fluid, and it can always change, and projects are always moving around where they are to make it easier for engineers to reason about. What's great about making it easier for engineers to reason about is that they're more inclined to write code. What they're not more inclined to do is write documentation. And that's the next part of this discussion. Let's admit it, writing docs suck. Who here enjoys writing documentation? Oh, wow. You are unique individuals. Oh, I applaud you. Yes. But let's admit it, for a majority of us, writing documentation for our software is not fun. And there's a couple of reasons for this. The first is that developers have knowledge about the software that they are writing, but they don't necessarily have the writing skills. And I mean expert pro-level technical writing skills. And so this is a problem because you have all the knowledge, but you don't have a way to communicate it fluidly to people. One of the things that we did on the Interact project is created a content guide for all of the Interact ecosystem. This content guide is a document that outlines how you write different things in the Interact project. It also provides templates for things like READMEs and code comments, so that when you're creating a new project and you need to create a README, you don't have to spend time thinking about what you should put in the README. There is a template you can work off of, and the amount of thinking that you need to invest in writing documentation is reduced. This content guide is also helpful, and I think this is particularly relevant to you as primarily Spanish-speaking individuals. A lot of documentation for software projects is in English. and it's not particularly translator-friendly. So one of the things that's outlined in the Interact content guide are guidelines for how you write English in a way that makes it easy for automated translators like the Google Translator to translate, so that you can write your documentation primarily in English, and you don't have to worry about localization. You've written it in a way that is easier for machines to automate. So if someone in Spain is reading your documentation, or in China, or in Ireland, they can read it in the language of their choice without having to get a custom localized version. You kind of build upon what's already available with automated translation tools. So content guides are really helpful for establishing guidelines for writing content and reducing the amount of time it takes to do it. But docs grow out of date really quickly, even if you've written them. This is true if you work at a very small company or a startup where things are changing very quickly, and the code changes faster than the documentation, and you've made this modification to this system, and now the docs you wrote 2 months ago are outdated. It happens in open source projects a lot. And so it's very easy for documentation to slip to the back of your mind as you work on writing code. One of the good ways to kind of combat this is to integrate doc coverage and doc builds into your CI pipelines. So some tools, I know ESLint, which is a linter for JavaScript, will actually allow you to configure rules that say, every function has to be documented, or there has to be this much level of coverage for your function comments as there is for your tests or anything else you might check coverage for. And then integrate those statistics into your CI builds so that developers are always thinking about documentation whenever they are submitting pull requests or merging things into master. Treat documentation as a first-class citizen within your software the same way that code is seen as a first-class citizen. So with these checks in mind, developers have to actually write software, which, as mentioned earlier, it requires a lot of upfront effort, which is where the templates that I discussed earlier come in as particularly helpful. Because if you're creating a README, if you're trying to write a tutorial, the guidelines are already in place. You don't have to spend a lot of time thinking about what you need to do. You can just do it, which is really empowering for a lot of software engineers and contributors. Now, at this point in your project, you have your contributors, you have your roadmap and vision, you have set up your project in a way that is composable and modular and allows different individuals to contribute to different components without having to know everything about the system. And you also have methods for documenting your code and ensuring that documentation is updated. What happens next? The future is a scary thing. It's particularly scary for open source projects. I think one of the ways that Interact has been particularly successful in thinking about this is adopting the notion that software is temporary, but ideas are forever. Earlier, we mentioned about how hoppers work in compilers makes it easy to use code as a way to spread ideas. And spread ideas that last. Indeed, there are so many enduring principles that come out of open source implementations of things like, the TCP/IP network stack or version control systems. The code might have changed the way it looks or might be distributed or delivered in different formats, but the ideas that code communicated live forever and have extended and exist in newer algorithms or ideas. And really, open source is not about the source. It's about the ideas that we exchange in an open format. And everything I discussed over the past few minutes has hinted at this point. Inclusivity is bringing more people who have good ideas to the table and ensuring that they can contribute those ideas to open source. Roadmaps ensure that those good ideas are planned out and that the individuals with good ideas have the path to implementing them. Well-designed software systems make it easier for those good ideas to come to life. Once they're actually brought to life, documentation makes it easier for those good ideas to spread. If you can read about a system or an open source project and understand how it works, you can grasp something fundamental or unique about the algorithms and ideas that it implements and take them into your own projects. All of this is particularly important because it means that all the time that we spend writing open source software, the hours and hours that are spent by maintainers and contributors building software are not about the software itself. It is about the ideas that are represented in that software and the potential they have. And so really, when I introduced myself earlier, I should have said that what I love is not open source, because that's just about the code, and code is temporary. But really, I love open ideas, and software is the way that I share those ideas. If you're interested in learning more about any of the things that have been mentioned in this talk, I have quite a few reference links here to the content style guide that I discussed earlier, the Interact GitHub organization, the blog, the Jupyter Notebook about diversity of underrepresented groups within PyData, and so forth. You can get these reference links by following me on Twitter. I have already posted them as we speak using the magic of scheduled crons. So you can follow me on Twitter, or they're under the PyConES 2019 hashtag for you to take and read. And that is the end of my talk. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to me talk about something that I love very much. I'm available to take questions for the next 15 or so minutes if you have them. Thank you.
¿Preguntas? Levantad la mano o algo, si hay alguna.
Hey, you said at the beginning you were talking about how in Interact you allow people to give them merge powers with the first, and especially you mentioned hackathon, and in Scrappy right now we are receiving many pull requests to the hackathon, and there are many that are simply typo corrections and such. So would you actually give merge permission to someone that fixed a typo in a comment?
Yes. I know this is so scary. Anyone gets merge permission. So one of the things that I've learned is that most people don't actually use merge powers immediately once they're given. People are very good about self-monitoring and growing into their role. And so, can you have bad actors who they get access to merge rights and they immediately start abusing it? Yes, that's where you have a code of conduct that says if you do this, you will be ejected from the project, blocked from the organization, and so on. But I would say 99% of the time, someone submits a pull request, it gets merged, they either never submit another one, or they keep submitting and they organically grow into the role themselves, instead of just kind of instantly abusing it. And so what happens by making an individual a member of the organization immediately is we allow them to grow into the maintainer role themselves instead of dictating when that title is given to them. And so it removes a lot of power and equalizes the situation because you are now empowered to take responsibility and ownership when you want as opposed to when we decide.
Thank you.
¿Una pregunta más?
Hello. Hi. Thanks for the very inspiring talk. I'm interested in learning more about this mono repo concept. So suppose I'm a Googler and I start working there. I want to start working my first project. So do I get a checkout of the whole ecosystem of Google tools, or how does it work?
I think so. I'm not going to speak for Google because I've actually never worked at Google. This is just stuff I've heard. But I can talk a little bit about the Interact project. So would you want to contribute to the Interact project, you clone a repository. The repository is on Interact. It's interact/Interact. This repository contains 20 odd packages. We use a tool called Lerna to manage these packages. Each package exists in its own directory. It has its own unit tests. It has its own README. The documentation that we generate, kind of like our Sphinx docs, so to say, are at the monorepo level. So all of the packages are documented in one page, but they have their individual unit tests and so on. And so it seems like it would be very overwhelming. You check out this code and suddenly everything's there. But one of the things that actually makes it a lot easier to manage is everything is documented. And I would say one of the things that I've heard contributors say is the monorepo is almost secondary to the actual code structure because it's laid out in a way that's a lot easier to reason about. The individual packages act as isolated units that happen to be in the same GitHub directory because they're related, but they're not deeply intertwined. They're all modular. So it seems like it would be overwhelming, but with proper documentation, unit tests, and also tooling to manage the monorepo and publishing and deployment, it's actually quite reasonable to manage. Several other projects implement this approach, and I think if you Google online, you might find other articles online of teams and projects that have taken this approach for their group.
Thank you.
Thank you for a most interesting talk. Really loved it. But it worried me. You didn't talk about the user for 1 second. Now, obviously, you've got time limitations. And your documentation was, I believe, software documentation. If you really want to be successful, I think you should be working with user pull rather than developer push. So now let the users write the user documentation, and in every field, chemical engineering, nuclear science, what have you, you'll have different users of, for example, Python or Python data, and my God, the package will be used. So this is one part which you cannot and must not neglect. Thank you.
Wait a second. Safia, I would like to use this opportunity to remind the audience that questions end with a question mark. En español, las preguntas empiezan con signo de pregunta y terminan con signo de pregunta. Muchísimas gracias. Creo que... Por supuesto.
Bueno, my question then is, how does Interact deal with users?
Sure, that's a great question. So in addition to our developer-facing documentation, we also have a user-facing documentation page. This is primarily for two things, the Interact desktop application and the Hydrogen extension. One of the things that's interesting about the Interact project is that our users are developers themselves, and indeed they are developers of the API. So one of the things I mentioned earlier is that the Interact monorepo contains the packages and also the desktop application, the web application. And they're co-located because one of the users of the Interact project is developers who use our core SDK to build their own notebook applications. So what we've essentially done there is we've made it easier for the Interact contributor to also be a user of the API itself. So when you modify a package within the mono repo, you immediately have to use the package as a user, an API user, when you modify the desktop application or the web application. And so one of the ways we do it is we get people, developers and contributors, to be the users themselves, to actually use the APIs, use the desktop application. We have a documentation page. I think one of the hardest things about user-facing documentation, and when I say this, I mean non-technical users, so individuals who are not programmers on a primary basis. These are people who use the Interact desktop application. They know how to code, but they don't know how to fix the software itself, and they might not be familiar with things like GitHub and Git, modifying code, things like that. And we try and bridge the gap with this. One of the things that we do is a small change. In all of our documentation pages, we have an edit this page link at the bottom. And when you click it, it automatically takes you to the GitHub editor view, where you can edit files within the web application, so that if a user sees that the documentation is incorrect, it's a lot easier for them to fix. They don't have to clone the project, make the modification locally, push. They can kind of use the web-based tools to make that change. So it's little things like that. The first is getting contributors to act like users and think like users. The second is making it easier for users to actually feel empowered to modify the documentation and write it themselves. And this is something that I think we're actively working on, and all projects are actively working on. There's no final solution to how you interact with your users, but those are some of the ways we do it.
¿Más preguntas? Allí. Levanta la mano, por favor.
Thanks for the talk. You mentioned companies like Stripe that are very active in open source. Okay, that's just one that caught my attention. So most of us work in companies. How do you make a case internally for open source if it's not part of the culture, to leadership?
Great. Yeah, great question. I can speak to my own experiences at the company that I work at that is leveraging the open source project that I contribute to. I think it depends on the organization. Or clarification, do you mean encouraging you to contribute to open source or using open source?
It would be more contributing also for a small project. I mean, say for instance, you might have pushback because of intellectual property reasons, but sometimes I mean, say, how do you, if you want, preach it internally? Because there are clear advantages, but I don't know if you have tactical advice. Thanks.
So I would say the first thing is when you are making a modification to an open source project, plan for it ahead of time. Document the change that you want to make and ensure ahead of time that there is no intellectual property issues that might come up with it. So kind of plan for it ahead of time and work with managers or your legal team to ensure that it's okay before diving into it. I think that's really good to do because it shows people you are proactive and you are willing to meet them halfway. The other thing I think is important, and I've seen be successful for me, is provide support and showcase that open source and open source maintainers and community provide actual value for the company. For example, if you run into an issue and it takes you an hour to debug, or it takes you weeks to debug, and you realize there is an open source solution or an open source maintainer has provided you with a helpful approach to that, thank them, call it out, make sure that people are actively recognizing the contributions and the value it brings to the organization, and kind of build the mind share slowly. I think in general, especially in organizations that are not as attuned to it, generally getting them to see it not only is crucial to the survival of their company, but is extremely valuable is really good. And if you're interested, I can't recall the name at the moment, but there is quite an interesting paper that was written a few years ago called Roads and Bridges by Nadia Egbel. And it's a paper that outlines how a lot of very successful billion-dollar software companies are dependent on open source software. They cannot exist without things like Ruby on Rails or MySQL or Python, and why it's really important for businesses to recognize that a lot of their monetary value is embedded in open source software. So I think that's a good paper to share with your colleagues and get them thinking about it as relevant to the business, not just as a, evangelism or a community thing.
Juan, ¿da para una más? ¿No? ¿Una corta? ¿Alguien tiene una pregunta corta?
If you are also shy, you are welcome to ask me questions in the hallway. Okay.
Bueno, ya está. Let's thank our speaker again, please.
Thank you, Safia.
I think the robot is confused about who gave the talk.
Thank you so much, Safia. Love you. I don't know. Hi. Vamos.